Oh.
You have the intro?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I wrote my own.
Okay, that's fine.
Tell me, what's your wife's name?
Mayan.
Mayan, okay.
Now, even though
Yeah.
almost every, when given the options, almost every community chose what was initially peace politics and the pandemic, and then became peace politics, Putin and the pandemic, after I had been on the Ukrainian border. And we have a lot of touching stories from there.
Yeah.
Here, because we chose the issue of the Kotel conversion,
And this trumps.
well, so
Whatever you want to
I've
talk
got to
about,
be
but-
mixing them up together in a way.
Okay.
It's going to be more of a challenge, but it can be done. Feel free to, no, do say, no. Feel free to actually clarify that.
Okay.
But, you know, I cover Israeli politics and I deal with those controversial issues day in and day out, and I'm going to be addressing what's going on with them. But I also had this wonderful opportunity to go to the border with Ukraine, and that's what people are talking about. So absolutely I'll be going into it.
All right. I'll make it work. It's okay.
Dafka, the Ukraine is what brings out crowds.
I'll say this was what we were originally. Give it a few more minutes. Friends, in order to accommodate the long-standing Jewish custom of not starting on time, we won't start on time, but we are hoping to start in the next few moments. So if folks want to begin moving their schmoozes somewhere into the seats, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Good evening. Welcome all those who are joining us, whether this evening in person or via our live stream. As we gather to discuss the final decisions that come out of March Madness. And that's the program taking place somewhere else. But before introducing our guest speaker tonight, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the generosity of Joni and Dr. Ronnie Levin for making tonight's program possible. In myriad ways, Joni and Ronnie have brought Israel to Jacksonville, even as they've also brought Jacksonville to Israel through initiatives like the Gift of Israel for B'nai Mitzvah. Tonight is just one more example of their passion for Eretz Yisrael, for our ancestral homeland, and their desire that, in the words of the psalmist, we never forget Jerusalem. I'd also like to acknowledge colleagues who are with us this evening, Chazan Holzer, Rabbi Rosenblum, others in our community. And before I introduce our speaker, I do have to just share a word about the evolution of tonight's topic. Originally, when we were first discussing topics, we thought to concentrate on the issue of religion in Israel, the Kotel and the many issues surrounding it, and what the future might portend for the relationship of the various religious streams in the United States and Israel vis-a-vis the Israeli government. As things would happen, we had something take place in Ukraine that we all watch anxiously each day as the violence escalates and as Israel, though certainly not a player in the way that Russia and the Ukraine are, or even NATO and its Western allies, still has a pivotal and strategic role both in its relationship to President Zelensky, the only other Jewish leader of a state outside of Israel, the Jewish community in the Ukraine, but also Israel's very delicate relationship with Russia vis-a-vis Iran and Syria, which has caused some careful treading along delicate lines. So this evening, our guest speaker will attempt to wrap this all together and address all of these issues as only he could do. So let me, without further ado, introduce our speaker, who grew up outside the Windy City, where he attended day school at the Ida Crown Jewish Academy and was graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. While his career as a journalist took him from the Miami Herald to the Arizona Republic, his heart was always drawn to Israel. After making Aliyah at the age of 22 in 1999, he served in an artillery unit in the IDF and later spokesperson for the IDF as a reservist. Currently, the chief political correspondent and analyst for the Jerusalem Post, he covers local elections, campaigns, and the affairs of the Israeli administration, but also interviews with prominent Israeli leaders, including prime ministers, members of Knesset, and other public figures. Outside of writing, he hosts Inside Israel Today, an English-language political podcast, in addition to making regular appearances on CNN, TRT World, and Al Jazeera. He's a frequent lecturer on Israel, having spoken in every major English-speaking country in the world and in all 50 states, including North Dakota. a resident of Jerusalem, where he lives with his wife Mayan and his 3 children. We are so pleased to welcome Gil Hoffman.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lubliner, and thank you to Joni and Ronnie for making this happen. I've been constantly impressed by the Jewish community of Jacksonville, because it does not happen in other places that I say I'm available and automatically every Jewish institution wants to host me all together. The fact that your community gets along so beautifully is something very special that you're very lucky to have. I want to thank the Jaffas for hosting me, and Daniel for taking me around and making sure my phone will work and that I could eat. And I love it that the kosher restaurant in Jacksonville is named Gillies. I felt very at home over there. And I love being back in Florida after 2 years. At the beginning of March 2020, I gave a couple lectures to a room full of 200 people over the age of 70. And then about 5 days later, people said, "Oh my God, what did we do?" And it didn't happen again for 2 years. And now I'm back in Florida, and a pandemic be damned, I hope it never comes back. Not in Israel, not here, not anywhere. And so this event tonight, I absolutely respect the people who are watching it in one way or another online, but I really appreciate the people that came here, showing that we can overcome any challenge. And that's really the message of Israel today. Israel's led the world in its response to the pandemic in a way that we can be proud of. And Israel has led the world in also showing that it can overcome even the most difficult political challenges. We went through 4 elections in 2 years. Being the political correspondent was not easy, as Israel proved Einstein's theory of insanity, of doing the same thing over and over and over and over again and expecting a different result. And the reason why we did that was because you had a majority of the people of Israel who supported Netanyahu's policies and a majority of the people in Israel who wanted to see him go. And really the only way a government could be formed in Israel was to form the most diverse government, not only in the history of Israel, but perhaps the most diverse government in the history of mankind on this earth. Where we have extreme right and extreme left and everywhere in between, and an Islamist Arab party, part of our governing coalition for the first time. The equivalent in the United States would be if Ted Cruz and AOC decided to run on the same ticket. If the various people that went into the Capitol building that day and the squad sat down together and said, "Let's think about what we have in common." That's basically the government that we have in Israel today. And it's not easy. They try to think of what they can have in common and accomplish. I'll try to oversimplify it before I get into the most complicated issues. When you oversimplify something, we'll use ABC, all right? We'll start with a B. What they have in common is Bibi, Netanyahu, that they don't like him. Love is a very powerful emotion, especially my love for my wife. But I've been covering politics for almost 25 years now, so I can say that hate is the most powerful emotion when it comes to politics. And so hatred of Netanyahu is the basis of our government. But is that enough for a government in Israel to survive for 4 years? The answer is, yeah. But would they feel good about themselves if they just had that basis and didn't actually accomplish anything? No. They want to get things done. So what can they get done? What can they agree on? And it hasn't been easy to find what they agree on. So first they started off with the C, COVID-19. They're against it. They realized that's something they all have in common. And that is the basis for what a government can do. It can fight the pandemic. That's great. They found another C, car accidents. They're against those too. But is that enough? No. So then they've been trying to find other things that they agree on. Right? In the letter A, you have the Abraham Accords, which universally in Israel people like and want to see expanded, and they'll be working on that. Israeli Arabs, having an Arab party that's part of the governing coalition for the first time is something incredible. And related to the Abraham Accords, because what happened was the Abraham Accords basis was countries in our region saying they're not going to wait anymore for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be solved. That all along the Arab countries weren't willing to normalize relations with Israel because they were waiting for the Palestinian leadership to make the sacrifices necessary to help their own people, and they realized it didn't make sense to wait for them anymore. They were missing out by not having relations with one of the strongest economies and most technological countries in the region. And so that's what led to Israel having the peace agreements with Bahrain and United Arab Emirates and Morocco. I got to go to Dubai. It's really cool. I'm from Chicago. I like tall buildings. And then the Israeli Arabs said, well, if they're not waiting in Dubai anymore, why are we waiting in Nazareth to normalize relations by joining a government in Israel? Why should our people suffer? You know, the way it works in the parliamentary system is that the spoils are divided up by the parties that are in power, that are part of the governing coalition for their constituencies. And the Israeli Arabs were never part of a governing coalition, so their constituency suffered, not due to racism, but due to bad politics, as I explained in the Wolf Blitzer show on CNN on the night that our government was formed. Okay? So bridging the gap between Jews and Arabs, that's another thing that they agreed on. Now, they thought that they actually had another. They thought that they also had matters of religion and state, that would be something without having the ultra-Orthodox in the government, that this would be a government that would make revolutionary changes. And there was an understanding that revolutionary changes have needed to be made for a while. So let's look at the demographics. Israel is 75% Jewish, 20% Arab Muslim, 5% Christians and other. And among those 75% that are Jewish, you get 10% define themselves as modern Orthodox religious Zionists. A little bit more than 10% define themselves as ultra-Orthodox. You get 30% who define themselves as secular, and 50% define themselves as traditional, whatever that means. It sounds good. It could mean anything when people are self-defining. It's a lowercase t. Well, those are the numbers now. Well, 25 years from now, the ultra-Orthodox are going to be 25% of the population. The way the numbers are going, Israel has to be preparing for that. There's some who've even said it's going to be much sooner than that because they're 25% of first graders. Well, what are we going to do when we're a country that depends on having a strong standing army when the ultra-Orthodox don't serve in the army? And what are we going to do economically if they don't work? Right now, you have only about 50% of ultra-Orthodox men who work. Among women, they have a higher percentage of women who work than secular women because they have to support their husbands and their many children. So the least controversial step that this government has done on matters of religion and state is try to pass legislation that facilitates more ultra-Orthodox entering the workforce. There were issues that they couldn't work because in order to avoid the army, they had to pretend not to work. They had to stay at least affiliated with their institutions of Torah learning. And steps have been taken to eliminate those barriers and facilitate them working. And there are all kinds of programs which in part are funded by, the Jewish Federation is involved in this talk too. So the Jewish Federations of North America support the Joint, which has programs that facilitate job training for the ultra-Orthodox. That's one of their key programs right now. So that is something that's actually being passed. Other things have proven harder. Reforming the industry of kosher certification in Israel. You'd think it would be relatively simple. People realize that the system right now is corrupt. Make it less corrupt. Decentralize things away from the chief rabbinate, which has been controlled by the ultra-Orthodox for 20 years, and never before. The chief rabbinate was always something that was holy for the modern Orthodox religious Zionists, because they saw Israel as the dawn of our redemption, of a religious gift from God, and which we saw in the Haftorah that we read yesterday in our synagogues about where Ezekiel said that the cities are going to be rebuilt and the Jews are going to come from all over the world, prophecies that we see come true every day right now. Whereas the ultra-Orthodox didn't really care. They didn't see the state as holy, but they took over the chief rabbinate because the last two elections for chief rabbi happened when the ultra-Orthodox weren't part of the government, and they wanted to stick it to the religious Zionists and take over what was theirs. And it's going to happen again. We have elections for chief rabbi again in December. And as long as the chief rabbinate is in the hands of the ultra-Orthodox, then they're not going to be particularly welcoming. Not on issues of making the kashrut industry easier to deal with, and not with conversion either. So the reforms in how to have competition within the kosher industry in Israel technically passed. The way that this government passed it is they passed it along with the budget in an omnibus bill. So people never really voted about it. They kind of did it in an underhanded kind of way. And so what the reform basically says is that you can have different companies compete instead of the chief rabbinate being in charge of all kosher certification. They would still be an umbrella regulatory board, but they wouldn't be the people that themselves give the kosher certification. And the goal of that is to make everything in the country cheaper, because it's the kosher certification monopoly that has kept prices high. So that they have sort of managed to do. Conversion is much, much harder. That has not passed. They tried to pass it before the Knesset left on its recess 2 weeks ago, and the Knesset's on a 2-month recess until the 9th of May. I don't see how they're going to pass any of it. It's Naftali Bennett, our prime minister, his own party, that has been stopping it. His religious affairs minister, his allies putting it forward, and his own people in the party are getting in the way. Our prime minister can't even control a party of 6 seats. There are those who say that the reforms and the conversion are more important than anything right now because of the people coming into our country from Ukraine and Russia, and who were already coming in before. Because there are people who are coming in who come in according to the law of return in Israel, which defines a Jew the way that Hitler defined a Jew, not the way that the Orthodox define a Jew, not a Jewish mother, but one Jewish grandparent. And most of the immigrants from Russia and Ukraine that were Jewish by Jewish law already came when the Iron Curtain came down. The overwhelming majority who were coming even before the war were people that met Hitler's definitions, but not the Orthodox definition. And so that was bringing in thousands of people who would like to convert, who would like to be a part of the Jewish society, but weren't willing to follow the strict standards of the ultra-Orthodox. And now, when you've had 20,000 people come from Ukraine and Russia since a month ago, and more coming 5,000 a week, it's going to become more and more of a challenge. And it's not changing anytime soon. Because the reform of the conversion process in Israel, putting it in the hands of local rabbis all over the country, or still Orthodox, but not in the hands of the centralized chief rabbinate, I don't see how it will move forward. Now, I'll get back to Ukraine momentarily. But you also have, initially it seemed like the Western Wall plan could advance. 5 years ago, Netanyahu, with the ultra-Orthodox as part of his government, passed a proposal that was a compromise. Everyone gave something up. It's said, and people forget about this, that the Western Wall, as we see it right now, would be officially a site for only Orthodox Jewish prayer. It would officially make the women of the wall illegal. And the southern wall excavation site, where the women of the wall always refused to pray because they wanted to be at the Western Wall for real, would be the site of non-Orthodox prayer. It gave the Orthodox what they wanted. It gave the religious pluralism in Israel a boost forward like never before. But the ultra-Orthodox then backed down under pressure from their own constituents. There were two things in particular that they had a problem with. One was that the plan said that the site of egalitarian prayer would be administered by the Reform and Conservative movements officially recognized by the state for the first time. And the second was that it said that there would be a fair and equal entrance into the men's section, the women's section, and the egalitarian prayer section. Now we thought every party in the government supported implementing this plan. But more and more are coming out of the woodwork who realize that one day they might have to form a government with the ultra-Orthodox, and they don't have the courage to do it. And so I don't really see how it's going to work anymore when I thought for sure it would be implemented. At best, what the Prime Minister says is that he's going to make the egalitarian prayer site that there is right now, which is actually administered completely by the conservative movement unofficially, look nicer. That's the best they're going to get. There's not going to be a way of entering it from the Western Wall itself, which actually is complicated to do anyway. You've got an entrance to the Temple Mount in between. That's as far as they are going to go. And that's it. And this is a failure of, going back to ABC. The other A that this government wanted to do was to reach out to American Jews and American Democrats in particular, not just Jews. There was a feeling among all the parties in our coalition today that Netanyahu didn't really care about reaching out to your left-wing American Jews and Democrats, that he really focused on the low-hanging fruit, on the evangelical Christians and on the Orthodox Jews in the United States, and didn't do enough to reach out to the 90% of the people in between preaching the converted and the unconvertible. And there was a feeling among all the parties that formed the government in Israel that this was a very dangerous neglect that Netanyahu did, in part because what we read in the first chapter of Exodus. It says, a leader came to power who did not know Joseph. And it didn't work out too good for the Jewish people then, right? Well, Joseph is the president of the United States. Now, I'm sure there are people in this room who voted for him and people in this room who didn't vote for him, people who like him and people who don't. But nobody can deny that he says constantly how much he loves Israel and that he was friends with Golda Meir back in the 1970s, well, whoever is the next Democratic president of the United States, whether it's going to be in 2 years or 6 years or 16 years, whatever, will not be someone who was friends with Golda Meir. And we have to get ready for that. We have to educate the Democratic leaders why it makes sense for them to be pro-Israel, why we are the most progressive country in the Middle East by far. And so that is a focus that this government set out to do and has not really done very well. And we're seeing right now the biggest difference I've seen since this government was formed between Israel and the United States when it comes to Iran. Right now, the Secretary of State is in Israel, and he came into an ambush. There's a meeting tonight, and there's another one tomorrow, of 5 foreign ministers from Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Egypt. And the people in Bahrain are representing Saudi Arabia, and the people from Egypt are representing the Jordanians, who happen to not be available. But it's really all of us together ganging up on the Secretary of State of the United States, and all telling him, this Iran deal that you're working on is insane. You're seeing what's going on with Putin. Putin could have been stopped by decisions made by America 10 years ago. And we're warning you, you're creating another monster. You're about to give the top sponsor of terror around the world, who just attacked America 2 weeks ago, you're about to give him all the money on the face of this earth, knowing full well that they're not going to use that money to help their own people. They're going to use it to try to murder innocent civilians around the world. You're going to recognize the top terrorist organization in the world, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, as not a terrorist organization. So they're all ganging up on the Secretary of State of the United States and telling him, you have to stop. We live here, you don't. That's what's going on right now. It's been a long time since I've seen, I guess since Obama with Netanyahu, a press conference of top people from the United States and Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel and the Secretary of State of the United States, and he's right next to him, the Prime Minister of Israel, saying, I hope he hears me when I tell him this. He's right next to you. He hears you. I guess he means listens, I guess, really implements it. And there's not much hope that America will turn its back on this deal. And that makes Israelis very worried. They think at the very least what they could get is maybe an American recognition for Israel to take more what we call proactive self-defense. Maybe receive compensation with all kinds of weaponry that we've asked for a long time, bunker busters or whatever. But that's not really what we're looking for. We're still hoping that things could be stopped or toned down or at least made to make logical sense. Because we know what happened 10 years ago. 10 years ago, 2012 and then 2013, there were commitments made in Washington about what was going on when you had another maniacal dictator who was murdering people left and right in Syria, Bashar Assad. And the President of the United States said, if he uses chemical weapons against his own people, that is a red line for us, and we're going to take action to stop it. And then when it happened, with undeniable proof, the response from America was absolutely nothing. And the Russians took that as a license to do the same thing. They invaded Syria. They went into Syria when America didn't, and they invaded Crimea and did what they wanted, with the world saying nothing. And that led to them doing it again now. That's what's going on right now. It all goes back to that original sin. And so Israelis have learned lessons from what's going on in Ukraine right now. Lessons like we have to rely only on ourselves. As much as we appreciate that we have allies around the world, and really when it comes to Israeli foreign policy and foreign relations, it's probably better than it's ever been in the history of the State of Israel, still, we can rely only on ourselves and on God. We've unfortunately learned that lesson the hard way, seeing what's going on with Ukraine. The other lesson is that all those people had been saying for a long time that Israel was at a disadvantage because we were strong, and that weakness was actually an advantage that could be exploited in today's world. Well, maybe they were wrong all along. Maybe being strong actually is a good thing. That's another lesson that we've gotten from what's going on in Ukraine. I interviewed the mayor of Kiev, former World Boxing Championship boxer Vitaly Klitschko, and he said, Israel's our model. We want Ukraine to be like Israel. We want to teach our people that when you go to war, everybody's involved, everyone has to do their part, like it is in Israel. He's got his advisors, former IDF people, training his people there. Israel itself isn't involved, but we've got plenty of former Israeli military men who are helping the Ukrainians. Whereas Israel decided itself to take a more of a mediation role because of many reasons. Number one being we do have Syria, Russia on our border right there, and we don't want to have a conflict with Russia. It's always a bad idea to start a war with Russia. We need to get along with the Russians. And the Russians see us as being beholden to them because of it, and so they feel comfortable and trust us as a mediator. And the rabbi mentioned that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is the only other Jewish leader in the world outside of Israel. Well, he also feels that we're kind of beholden to him. He can talk to us because he's Jewish. He can play the Jewish guilt trip to us. And he can try to use that to his advantage, as he tried to do in the speech to the Knesset that I covered a week ago. So that also makes us fit to be a mediator. Also, we realize that we have to be careful and sensitive because there are hundreds of thousands of Jews potentially who would be immigrants to Israel in both Russia and Ukraine. And we have to take it, this is the electorate of our government that we're taking into account also. And last but not least, being a mediator for a change and not one side in a conflict is not so bad. You know, give us a chance to be Switzerland for a change. It's really cool. It gives us respect around the world in a way that we never really had before. Even though it's at great risk, we look bad. I'm about to speak on college campuses this week. I'm going to be at Emory and Georgia State tomorrow, the following day at Hopkins in Maryland, following day at Drexel and Franklin Marshall in Pennsylvania. I've got UCLA coming up. I know they're just going to say, why are you just on the bad side? Obviously, there's a good side and a bad side here. How could Israel be doing this? And so I can explain why it made sense there. Somebody has to end the war, right? You need to have a mediator, and that's what Israel's trying to do. While giving more humanitarian aid than anybody else is, we're the only ones with a serious field hospital there in Ukraine that we can be very proud of, 100 tons of aid. That's who we are. And I got to see myself, by going to the border with Ukraine, what Israel and Jewish organizations and non-Jewish organizations are doing there to help people. I was brought there by the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, which is an organization of Christians helping Jews. I saw on the border between Israel and Ukraine, between Moldova, where I went, and Ukraine, what is the first tent when you cross the border into Moldova? It's Israel Aid, which is an organization of Israelis helping non-Jews. It was a tent full of toys and games and baby food and diapers, because who's going across that border? A steady stream of women and children. I went through 4 countries to get to the Ukrainian border, but I also felt like I went through time to another era that I never thought I'd see. And I got to see and talk to people who had walked for hours to get to that border, in the rain, in the snow, in the mud. Mostly women with little girls with pink backpacks, who I'm sure weren't given much time to decide what to put in those pink backpacks, not knowing if they would ever see the rest of their possessions and their father and husband. not knowing if their home would still be there if and when they'd come back. I met there a woman named Anna Galanchikaya. She's 89 years old. And she told me that when she was 9 years old, she fled with her father from the Nazis. And they went in a horse-drawn wagon, and they just kept on riding east into the Ural Mountains. Her father taught her how to steer and ride herself at the age of 9, just in case something would happen to him, so she can just keep on going east. And she said, I didn't believe back then that 80 years later I'd be going in the opposite direction, fleeing from the Russians. It's very, very powerful meeting such people. I didn't know whether I'd really feel comfortable going on this trip when it was offered to me. I have a very cushy job. I've never been a military reporter before in the trenches. I'm the political correspondent. I have an office in the Parliament building. I have a front row seat in the gallery looking ahead, looking down at the plenum, and the taxpayers pay for my food and my gym. And here I said, okay, fine, I'll go to the border. I'll have an experience. But I wasn't sure about it. I like my children. I didn't want to do anything unsafe. And then I said, you know what, I'll go, but I don't think I want to be there on Shabbat. It wouldn't be comfortable being there on Shabbat. And you know what, I'm really glad that they said, no way, you have to be there on Shabbat too. Because of what I saw on Shabbat. I saw the Orthodox synagogue around the corner from my hotel, buses constantly going there of people receiving help. The rabbi did everything you're not allowed to do on Shabbat, but are allowed to do for saving lives, for what we call pikuach nefesh. The rabbi was constantly on his phone. He drove to the border on Shabbat. He came back with refugees and cooked for them. It was absolutely incredible to see. There were mattresses all over the synagogue. There were tents outside. They were full of people. So I saw Jews saving Christians, Christians saving Jews. I saw Christians saving Christians. Moldovans just go to the border and say, wherever you need to go in Europe, I'll take you. People opening up their homes to strangers. It was very beautiful. And then for the later service, I went to the Chabad. And there, they didn't have tons and tons of people. It was a very small place. And it turned out that the rabbi had told the people that normally daven there at the Chabad of Kishinev, don't come this Shabbat. Have you ever heard of a Chabad rabbi saying, don't come? But he said, you guys are okay. You have food. You have a place to be. We're opening up only to the people who desperately need us this Shabbat. And I looked and I saw who was there. It was all the rabbis of Ukraine who had, little by little, managed to get out hundreds of their congregants. And then they left last, locking the door and taking the Torah scroll with them. And so I went to the service there, and I saw how rabbi after rabbi was called up to the Torah for an aliyah, and they all then said the Hagomel blessing of their lives being saved. Now, that's a blessing that's been cheapened over time because it says if you go on a transatlantic flight, then you say it. And until COVID came, a transatlantic flight didn't seem such a dangerous thing. And so people would go to Florida and come back to Israel, and they'd say that blessing, and people would say, okay, you didn't really have to make that blessing, did you? You kind of cheapened it. But here, this was real. Hagomel, Hagomel, Hagomel. And then I got the last aliyah in the book of Exodus. And I thought, I didn't belong with these people. Why are they giving this to me? And I had to think about it. And then the service ended. And there was a kiddush outside the service with barely any food. And it was freezing cold because the synagogue was being remodeled so it had no walls. And I wanted it to end as fast as possible and go back to my warm hotel. But then the rabbis started dancing. And I thought, oy vey, why did I go to Chabad? The rabbis are dancing. And then I started listening to what they're singing when they're dancing. The song that they sang was V'samachta bechagecha. They sang a holiday song. And I asked them when they finished dancing, why out of all songs did you sing that? Are you starting at Purim or Passover early? And they told me it had nothing to do with that. They told me it was like a kid with a piece of candy, and he asks his father for the candy, and the father says no. So smart kid, he makes a blessing on the candy. Don't want to disgrace God's name. If you make a blessing, you've got to eat it. That's what they were doing. They were pushing God to make their tragedy into a holiday. And I was astounded by their faith. The last rabbi out of Kiev, I saw a message that he sent to the consul who got him out, the Israeli consul. The message said, thank you so much for saving my life. He sent the message as he crossed the border out of Ukraine an hour after Shabbat started. Now, I can understand the rabbis saying you can cook on Shabbat, that's saving lives. I can understand driving to the border to save refugees. I didn't know you could send a text message. Is that saving a life? But it's beautiful that the rabbi decided this is something I have to break Shabbat for, to say thank you. I went on that plane on the way back home, full of Ukrainian refugees going to their new home. And that's when I really thought about what happened there, that maybe I did understand why I received, why I was the last person to be called up to the Torah in the book of Exodus. Because I myself went through an Exodus on that trip. I'm never going to complain about being cold again. I'm never going to complain about being hungry. And I got to see firsthand how any challenge can be overcome. So Israel's facing plenty of tough challenges right now, has many difficult decisions to make ahead, and but I believe that with God's help, things are going to get better, and challenges can be overcome for Israel and for the Jewish people, and also for America. Thank you very much.
Opportunity for some questions.
And people can feel free to ask about anything. The evolving topic here made it a challenge. My 8th grade English teacher is here, and learning segues when you're writing is very challenging. And tonight was more of a challenge than usual when it comes to segues of different topics here. But people can bring up any topic related to Israel, Ukraine, Iran, whatever. Matters of religion and state.
Let me just see. Up, there we go. Okay, I'll pass the mic so everybody can hear Edward.
People should say their name before they ask the question.
Hi, I'm Edward Tannen. I'm a little curious. You said you're going to be speaking at college campuses. Aren't you afraid of being canceled? And from what I've read about UCLA, you're working at a buzzsaw there, aren't you?
I've spoken on campuses in 50 states, and some of the worst in Canada too. And there is no place of more ignorance than college campuses in North America. They are places where misinformation is spread and where the good guys get yelled at, and it's a challenge. But somebody's got to go there and tell them what's really going on. And if I get yelled at or heckled or whatever, I've had walkouts. I went to Northwestern, and I remember I spoke there at the Medill School of Journalism, and there was a group of Muslim students who were bussed in They were high school students. I only found that out later. You can't really tell they were wearing their hijab. And they stood up and heckled me during my talk. Now, what was amazing about that was they paid a $12 admission fee. 20 of them. When they got up after 5 minutes. So, whatever, I can handle it.
Yeah, I have, working? Okay. I have two questions, short answers. What is the relationship between Israel and Putin?
Sure. And what's the second one?
The second one is, I've seen in the paper, the New York Times, that the three Arab countries are in Israel now, talking about the relationship between them. Will that eventually affect the rest of the Arab countries?
What?
Affect the relationship with the other Arab countries?
Okay. So, look, Israel's foreign policy, I will repeat the questions. The first question was about Israel's relationship with Putin, and the second was whether the fact that you have so many Arab foreign ministers that are in Israel right now will lead to more Arab countries joining. It all relates to Iran, because what brought about the Abraham Accords, besides mistakes made in the United States, was a mutual fear of Iran. It's countries realizing that we have more in common than what divides us, and that we actually need each other's help in order to deal with the imminent nuclear threat from Iran. And so that's the reason why you have a summit right now, and that is what would lead to more Muslim countries in the region normalizing relations with Israel, in part because they need us and we need them. And how does that relate to Putin? Well, Russia's far. Normally, we wouldn't have to have any relationship with Putin. But we had to, because Iran was in Syria, and we needed someone to go into Syria and be some kind of rational actor. And we were hoping it would be America. After all, America promised. But America broke their promise. And then who came in? Putin came in. And Putin was a rational actor, but it sounds disgusting to even say it now. But in Syria, that's the role he has played, compared to Iran. When we talk about the lesser of two evils, that's usually a cliche. What's going on in Syria right now, yeah. Russia is the lesser of two evils, genuine evils. And so we have to tolerate one evil in order to protect ourselves and the world from the much, much greater evil from Iran.
Good evening. Sorry, Wyatt Bowers. So I just got back from Israel.
I don't know what time zone I'm in myself.
Yeah, and I just got back from Israel a week ago, so I'm still adjusting. So last Shabbat, I don't know, 2 Shabbats ago, whatever, I was in Jerusalem and went to the Kotel area. And I will admit here in synagogue that I had my phone out and was actually taking a picture, which you're not supposed to do on Shabbat, in the Western Wall area. Someone came up to me and asked me to put the phone away. And I said, well, I'm kind of standing. I wasn't up front. I was in the back. And they didn't like my answer. And I said, fine, I'll go to the egalitarian section. And they're like, I don't even know where that is. And I said, well, thankfully I do. When I walked out, because as you mentioned, that's outside of the entrance area.
Yeah.
But that main entrance is the only entrance area to the Kotel that has a separate men's and women's, lines. Except quite often, the women's side is closed and they go in together anyway.
What?
So there's a men's line and a women's line, but quite often the women's line is closed and men and women go through the same line.
You mean saying on the way into the section?
Correct.
Okay.
Through security. So the question is there really a need for that separate line?
But that's
and why
a line.
is it done?
It's not where people pray.
No, it's the security line.
Right.
But why it's even separated there at all?
They can be in line together.
Well, there's a men's entrance and a women's entrance, and sometimes the
come
women's
on.
entrance is closed. I don't know.
No, that's not the problem.
Okay.
Well, what I can say is that I kind of like that the egalitarian prayer section has no line.
Correct.
My daughter had I took her to read Torah there. When my daughter had a bat mitzvah, I taught her to read the Genesis, the creation of the world, and she read it there at the Kotel, and it was very meaningful. And then she came to my Orthodox synagogue, and while she didn't read it during services, because people wouldn't have felt comfortable with that, after services, she read the same Torah portion that she read at the Kotel, and all the men stayed and were very respectful, and it was very beautiful.
Other maybe questions? Okay, we'll go from that side, but first, Ronnie.
Hey, Ronnie Levin. I don't know how it is in the rest of the country, but at least in the South, I see such a strong feeling by the Christian right for Israel, and I was wondering how Israel can help cultivate that, and what do you think would be the effect if they didn't have such a strong love for Israel on our Congress and the votes and our future relationship with Israel from the United States?
Ronnie, I know that there are a lot of American Jews who are very skeptical of evangelical Christians and don't want to be on the same side as them. Whereas in Israel, people don't really worry about that. In Israel, we appreciate any help that we could get from anyone. We see what evangelical Christians are doing in terms of helping the poor in Israel and the immigrants and everything, from the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews and the International Christian Embassy and all kinds of groups from around the world. We appreciate them, we love them, and we work together with them very closely in all kinds of projects. And if they have views that are kind of icky on different things in America, that's not really something we have to deal with. If there's a theological dispute about what will happen in the future when the Messiah would come, we'll have that argument then.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Dubovitz. I'm originally from Ukraine, Kyiv, very long time ago, never been back. But I just want to say thank you. This is not a question. It's just thank you for organization. I was constantly on the phone with my relatives, how it was organized by Israeli to bring all the buses to the synagogues and take whoever comes, they didn't even check if you're Jewish or you just Ukrainian or Christian, whatever. They took the whole families, and I have an aunt who is 91 years old, and she never, the last 4 years, she didn't get down from the 5th floor. She had to travel from Kyiv because they were under attack constantly. And how well it was organized. They drove them from every place, not only from Kyiv, from Cherkasy, from Chernovtsi, from all over the Ukraine. And it was organized so fast. They drove everybody to Moldova, and it didn't take much. In 1 week, they were already in Jerusalem. And I just want to say thank you. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you for organization. I've been in Israel 3 times, and I wish I could go more often, and I will go soon back again.
You've got more relatives to visit now. It's easier to visit them now that they're in Israel and not in Ukraine.
I have a lot of relatives in Israel, a lot, just in every place is Israel, and I love Israel. And COVID was holding us back. Now it's no more.
This is the time
but
to come.
I just want to say thank you again, and for organization, for everything what Israel did, if not only for Jews, for Christians, for everybody. In whatever they're doing in a war, sending the doctors, sending the help, humanitarian help, everything. Thank you.
Wonderful. Look, it went viral what Natan Sharansky said about when he grew up there in Donetsk, that he didn't know what it meant to be Jewish, but he knew it was a bad thing. It was the worst thing you could call another person was a Jew. And that now being Jewish helps the people of Ukraine get out, that they know that there's someone who cares about them. It was a beautiful thing to say. It's not entirely true, because the non-Jews also are being treated wonderfully by non-Jewish organizations who are doing great work. But what you said about her never leaving the 5th floor, I met this really nice man, Zev Vladimir Wolf. His name means wolf. And he had never left Kiev, and he's going to Israel, making Aliyah, having never left his city before, and he's in his 70s. It was pretty amazing. And I asked him, who's coming with you? Who's moving to Israel with you? And he says, my dog and my wife.
Hi. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm wondering, what do you wish Israelis understood about American Jews, and what do you wish American Jews understood about Israelis?
The question is what I wish Israelis understood about American Jews and what I wish American Jews understood about Israelis. I could give a full lecture, obviously, but the rabbi's sitting down. I wish Israelis understood the pluralism and the togetherness of American Jews. That's something that they can teach Israel, especially how integrated you are here in Jacksonville in a beautiful way. Jacksonville can teach Israel tolerance and what we call in Hebrew arevut hadadit, mutual friendship and alliance, I guess, taking care of each other, and understanding a little more of a live and let live with whatever your religion is. And I used to say your politics too. Now we can't really learn from America at a time of hyperpolarization. And I get really offended when people say that in Israel you also have hyperpolarization. I can understand why they think that we have that because we had 4 elections in 2 years. But that's not what we had that America had. We had one populist right-wing leader who isn't going away. That we have like America, but we don't have hyperpolarization. If anything, on diplomacy, security, economy, people in Israel are closer than they've ever been. They're less divided than they've ever been. Our elections weren't about those things. Our elections were about Netanyahu. So that's what Israel needs to learn from America, is religious pluralism and tolerance. What American Jews need to learn better about Israel is how to handle crises. We've been under constant threat since Israel was founded, and it means you need to adapt and overcome bureaucracy and do things quickly and without hassle, and not everything has to follow exactly the rules that have been set exactly that have to be followed. Sometimes you got to work around those rules and go through the red tape, and that's something that Israelis know how to adapt and do very well.
Hi, my name is Stav. I'm from the Jewish Agency. Thank you for coming to speak with us. It's nice to hear someone else speaking about Israel from the other side. My question for you is, what's your prediction about this coalition and government surviving for a full term? Also, when they switch at the middle.
Okay, so Stav points out that the basis of the government in Israel today is you have a rotation for prime minister. It's supposed to happen on the 27th of August of 2023. That our current prime minister, Naftali Bennett, is supposed to become the alternate prime minister, not vice prime minister. It's legal nuance. And our alternate prime minister currently, and our foreign minister, Yair Lapid, is supposed to become the prime minister. And a few other jobs are supposed to switch around. Gideon Sa'ar is supposed to, who was our justice minister, is supposed to become the foreign minister. Our interior minister, Galanchikaya, is supposed to become the justice minister. Naftali Bennett is supposed to become the minister of interior. And anybody who thinks that the prime minister is really going to take a step back and become a minister of interior, they don't really get how people work. I don't see it happening. What I do see is Naftali Bennett retiring from politics. He's a millionaire. He can go back to making a lot of money. His wife and kids were never really into the whole politics thing. They never even moved into the official prime minister's residence in Jerusalem. They refused to take part in it. They went on a vacation without him as a sign of protest to him. I don't see him, after he hit the top, taking a step down and staying in politics. It doesn't make any logical sense. Which would make Ayelet Shaked, his number two, is maintained her right-wingness in a way that Bennett didn't as the leader of the party. And I don't see her, and I've asked her directly about it and watched her squirm and evade the question, I don't see her facilitating Yair Lapid, who's center-left, forming a government being prime minister. In a Knesset that has 80 right-wing MKs plus another 8 in the blue and white party who happen to hate Yair Lapid. It doesn't work. What's a lot more likely is this Knesset still continuing to last, but somebody else becoming prime minister. It's possible that Benny Gantz could form a government with only 8 seats instead of the 6 that Bennett has. The most likely scenario, though, is that there would be a tremendous push on Netanyahu to take a temporary break in order to keep the right in power. Basically, what's going on is Netanyahu is the only one in Likud who can form a government because of all the enemies that he's had over time. When you have a job for a very long time, he's the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history, you make enemies. That happens with any job that people have for a long time, except rabbi. So according to the way this government works, if the 27th of August 2023 comes, Lapid becomes prime minister. If the Knesset is dissolved and we go to elections before then, Lapid automatically becomes prime minister for about 6 months at least, during the time of the election itself and the aftermath, the time it takes to form a government, even if you could form a government after one election and not 4. So the only way to stop a center-left government, a center-left prime minister anyway, is by having someone else in Likud form a government. And with this Knesset, right. Someone like Nir Barkat, who was mayor of Jerusalem for 10 years and was just in Washington, meeting with congressmen for more than 2 weeks in Washington, showing, look, I can speak to the world in beautiful English too, just like Netanyahu. He is a venture capitalist who has all the money in the world. He literally made $200 million over the last 6 months. $200 million. Himself. Exit of a high-tech company that he invested in 20 years ago. And he was already doing okay before that. He is a likely person who could form a government with the current Knesset. That's where I see. There would be a vote of constructive no confidence, is what it's called. Oh, sorry. A vote of constructive no confidence is how, in a parliamentary system, you can replace a prime minister without the Knesset being dissolved.
Hi. Well, thank you. First of all, I want to say I'm glad to hear you're going to Franklin and Marshall College. Oh, cool. That's where I went. And you should know that it's Lancaster.
Lancaster, not Lancaster,
right.
I know.
That's right.
I've been there. It's near Bethlehem.
No.
How do you say it?
No, what?
The Bethlehem that's in Pennsylvania, they pronounce it funny.
But it's not close to
Oh, Ephrata.
Yes, Ephrata. Bird in hand.
Okay.
Paradise.
Okay. It's Ephrata instead of Ephrata.
Yeah. My second question maybe is going to be a bit pointed.
Sure.
Obviously, Israel's doing terrific things in Ukraine, but I wanted to just push back on you a little bit about your comments about, so Israel can play a neutral party now, just like Switzerland, because Israel's a little concerned about Russia. Well, maybe the United States was a little bit concerned about Russia too, and maybe back in 2012, and it maybe still is in fomenting a possible nuclear reaction. If you know, I felt at first, well, why shouldn't the United States try to enforce a no-fly zone in Ukraine? And you know, I've been reading articles on both sides of that, and just like Israel's a little concerned about pushing Russia in the wrong way, maybe it's okay for the United States to be a little concerned about pushing Russia in the wrong way.
So the question is, isn't America playing a more moral role in Russia, Ukraine than Israel is?
No. My question was whether you were given a rationale of why Israel is trying to be neutral, and not giving the United States some credit for the role, the way it's trying to play the role.
Look, America's a superpower. America's the leader of the free world. They have to be completely on the side of justice and liberty, to use the words that Joe Biden has been using lately. And that's a responsibility that they have, that we're not. We're not the leader of the free world. We can take our interests into account more than other countries can, more than America can. We can choose to protect ourselves in a conflict, and by being a mediator, if anything, we take the pressure off of us to be on the obvious side of Ukraine. If we were doing nothing, then, okay, we look really bad. But if we're mediating, then it's okay. Does that make sense? No?
Well, I do have a question for you, Gil, but one from
Ladies
Andrea,
first.
and we'll try to wrap by 8:30.
People need to watch the Oscars, right?
Thank you so much, and excited you're going to Emory. I have 2 daughters there, and they're very involved with pro-Israel.
Encourage them to come tomorrow night.
Of course they'll be there tomorrow night. No question. So my question relates to the next generation of Israelis. Your thoughts on the morale for, I don't know your children's ages, but their contemporaries in terms of the future, knowing that it is a different time, and what's keeping them strongly Zionistic and wanting them to stay and live there in the future.
The question is about the next generation of Israelis and keeping the morale together when you've got less motivation. And it's a very legitimate question, because Israel was formed out of the ashes of the Holocaust, but not because of the Holocaust, with the strength of the Zionists who were settling the land 50 years before that, in a collective socialist kind of way, with that kind of ethos of the kibbutz movement and everything. And then over time, Israel's become the least socialist country in the world, with hyper-capitalism. And the thinking was that as Israel became much less of a collective society and much more of an individualistic make-money kind of society, that people wouldn't want to be serving in the army, and that the national institutions would crumble because the young people wouldn't get into it. And what's happened is the exact opposite has happened. We've seen in the operations that there have unfortunately been, where you had reservists be drafted en masse, that you had more than 100% turnout. And I'm not a math major to understand how you get more than 100% turnout, but that's what's happened. And whenever you have times of joy and times of tragedy, the people of Israel have united in a beautiful way, whether it's this past summer when we won our Olympic medals. First Olympic medal won by a woman, Linoy Ashram, who just retired a couple days ago, to see the way the people of Israel united around her in such a beautiful way. When an Israeli vessel, tried to reach the moon and crashed into the moon, but Israeli drivers. We saw how that brought people together, and the terrorist attacks over the last few days, seeing the way the people of Israel unite in tragedy also. We were still very much in that regard emotionally a collective society, and that gives me hope for the future. The rabbi gets to ask the last question.
Well, like all rabbis. Okay, go ahead. Yes.
I'm Stephanie Thompson.
You're also very patient.
Thank you. I have the patience of Job, anyone will tell you. Well, I appreciate the enthusiasm that you're portraying for young Israelis. There is a growing trend among young American Jews towards anti-Zionism and anti-Zionist views. How, in social media in particular, how do you speak to this alarming trend, especially among very socially media engaged young American Jews?
Wow. Stephanie, there's nothing more important for the future of Israel than that. And every Jewish organization in America is involved in it. And the approach that works is being, first of all, very positive in educating them, using their own way of which they get information through social media. You have to be proactive, and you have to teach them how to be proactive themselves, proactive and reactive within the conflict and beyond the conflict. It's an uphill battle, but the more educated they are, and it has to start the youngest time possible because college is too late. And there are wonderful programs that take Jewish public school students and teach them what's going on in the Middle East. There was a program that I was involved in called Write On for Israel, WRITE, that aims to train future journalists, I guess, from public school students, and also trains them and teaches them about Israel and everything. There are all kinds of programs that get your children ready for college, because they're going to go to a place where they're not only anti-Israel, they're anti-Semitic. You want your kids to not be afraid of that, to walk as proud Jews on college campuses, even if it's a challenge. I was one of only 5 or 6 kippahs at Northwestern on the campus. I had kids come up to me out of nowhere I've never seen before and just confess their sins. To tell me they haven't been to a synagogue since their bar mitzvah, but they're Jewish too. And first I didn't understand what was going on, like, go away from me, I don't care, go. But after a while I realized it was responsibility. And we have a responsibility as the kind of Jews who do go to a synagogue and come to a program like this, to do what we can to educate our children and to educate each other's children, to be ready before you send them out to war. Because Israel's fighting 3 battles for its existence. On the military battlefield, we obviously have an advantage. On the airwaves and social media, people will disagree with me, but I think it's even. And on college campuses, we're at a great disadvantage. And so before you set your kid into that, you have to educate them, and you have to also educate yourself on which campuses are more comfortable than others. I'm going to UCLA next week. Don't send your kid there. University of Florida has a wonderful Hillel. I've had great experiences there. Not too far away in New Orleans, in Jew Lane, there's all kinds of campuses that have much more positive environments for being Jewish and proud on campus.
So, as always, one question equals 2, because Kohelet says two, tovim hashnayim min ha'echad, the two are better than one. I think the easier question that I'll pose first is your thoughts on the recent decision of AIPAC to get into the political
To be a PAC.
to be a, not just a PAC in name, but a PAC and have a super PAC, and whether that has a chance of backfiring in terms of ending up fueling some of the partisanship that AIPAC has traditionally tried to avoid, or whether this was a logical extension of what AIPAC was doing, having heard both sides, including reading an article recently by Tom Dine that expressed deep reservations about this particular move.
I hope the second one's easier, Rabbi.
No, I'm afraid it's not. I'll ask the second one as well. The second question is, in some ways, one of, maybe it was necessary, but David Ben-Gurion's original sin was to set up the religious pluralism failure that today's Israelis are heir to. As the Haredi population can only grow in the future, and at a time when right now, not the only time, but at a time when the Haredim are not involved in the government, if, im lo achshav ematai, if signal change and reform can't be undertaken, when will it be? And I say it against the background of seeing a very significant number of Jews heading toward Germany and Berlin, as opposed to Israel, 3/4 of those Ukrainians not being halachically Jewish. And what would it take to finally get us to a place? Is there anything, or is this really just going to be a dilemma through the ages?
Wow. So, repeating the question will be complicated. But the first one regarded a decision by AIPAC to go from being the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee and not a political action committee, which is something that gives money to specific candidates in order to advance a cause. And for many years, their disclaimer was AIPAC is not a PAC. We support Republicans and Democrats equally, and the parties in Israel equally, and we stay above the fray. And now they've chosen to actually give their money directly, as opposed to just educating congressmen from both sides of the aisle and bringing them to Israel. It was a strategic decision that they made to be more proactive, that's what their fundraisers wanted them to do, and not beat around the bush anymore. Disclaimer, I've spoken for AIPAC many times in many states, including this one. Obviously, I've not spoken for them since this decision was made, which was recent. And with the pandemic, they have not gone back to hosting speakers like me yet. So I haven't had to think about what I think about it yet until this very second. I'm still thinking about it. You let me continue thinking about it? Okay. I want whatever ends up helping Israel because we need AIPAC more than ever to be educating people right now in order to make sure that the congressmen that are uneducated come to Israel, learn about the geopolitical situation that we're in, because they come back changed and they come back getting it. So, I mean, as long as that role is not neglected in any way, I hope that them giving the money the way they do won't change that, is all I can say, I guess. The second question, as complicated as it was, is actually easier. The rabbi points out, when Israel was founded, its prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, let a few hundred Torah scholars who had survived the Holocaust receive exemptions from serving in the IDF. They did not have to serve in the army. because just like artists don't have to serve in the army and singers don't have to serve in the army, they had a special talent. They were called Iluyim, the greatest Torah scholars. But they were the only Torah scholars at the time, and the others were murdered. And the Chazon Ish, the leader of ultra-Orthodox Jewry that survived the Holocaust, said to Ben Gurion, these will be the Torah teachers of tomorrow to rebuild after the Holocaust. And Ben Gurion was persuaded by that. So back then, it was a few hundred, big deal. And then it became 30,000. And there was no way of limiting it. So the rabbi's question was basically, is it going to continue to spiral out of control, or can something happen? And if the fact that a government that has no ultra-Orthodox fails to do it, isn't that proof that it can never be done and we're doomed? Did I get it right? Okay. So it sounds terrible, but one thing that gives hope that those things can be changed is that the rabbinic leadership of the ultra-Orthodox is completely falling apart and dying. Rabbis dying is not necessarily what you want to hear as a good thing, right? But Rabbi Kanievsky was the second to last, who died last week at the age of 94, was the second to last of the old-time rabbinic Torah greats from before the Holocaust. And there's only one left, and he's turning 99 next month, Gershon Edelstein. And after that, the ultra-Orthodox are going to splinter completely because they have no obvious leader. That's going to make it a lot harder. They had one big rabbi who just got caught negotiating with Yair Lapid and giving a safety net to the current government. Others would find that outrageous. And then rabbis dabbling in politics will be distasteful. And they've got a big mess that they're going to have to be solving very soon. And the leader of Shas just got convicted again, the Sephardi Ultra-Orthodox Party. And he was taking really the place of his rabbi who died, and in terms of his charisma. And his time is limited too. So, and all the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox parties are in their 70s and in their last Knesset. So, I don't know if it makes things better, but they're about to enter a very big political crisis, and I don't know if they're going to be in the next government. And if you have the ultra-Orthodox not in the government for a while, when Netanyahu goes, if Netanyahu ever goes, you can have the right and the center and the left join, not the extremes that we have right now, but the center right, center left, center, joining together to form governments much easier than there were in the past. And then you don't really need the ultra-Orthodox the way Netanyahu always needed them to allow him to focus on diplomacy, security, economy, and ferret out the matters of religion and state to them. That could lead to the ultra-Orthodox not being part of the government for a significant period of time, in which case reforms could happen in a more earnest kind of way. So that gets back to the original topic of kotel conversion and kosher that we've tried to tackle here, among many, many other issues affecting Israel and the Jewish people. And so I'll ask myself the last question, which people always ask me, what can I do to help Israel from where I live? And I tell people that helping Israel is easy, EASY, which stands for education, advocacy, solidarity, and your money. But I don't talk about the why, your prayers. We pray that there will be a better day ahead for the people of Israel and the state of Israel, and also for America. Thank you very much. Worked it all in.
Yeah, you did. The Tom Dunn article that I read.
Please email it to me.
It was against the background of 36 of the congressmen that have received funds in support were also refused to
Recognize that there's a different president.
2020 election results,
Put
which
it
has
in your
occasioned a lot
I
of
shall.
uproar.
We're in Illinois.
Where am I going to be speaking? In Bethel and Highland Park.
Okay, is somebody going to let all of Lincolnwood know?
Sure, I'll put up there that
Yeah, you should.
people want to come.
I've got too many people already that are asking and I didn't have an answer.
No problem, that's the answer.
Did you guys get a picture together?
It's great.
Did you get a picture together?
Oh, yeah. Wasn't my student,
No, I appreciate it. You came to talk at a lot of words,
Yeah.
a lot of terms that you might not
Yes.
know.
Oh, no, honey, I read Daniel Silva.
Okay.
So do I.
I mean, it's where I learned so
I just
much.
wanted to tell you
No.
it was excellent. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
Couldn't have done it without the two of you. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about our American ambassador.
Oh, he keeps on putting his foot in his mouth.
Also, all my
Thank you for coming.
patients, the Christian right, they all want y'all to be president of the United States.
So does his wife.
Oh, that's true. Sarah?
He got caught saying it on tape conversation one time. That had he been born in America, he would have been president of the United States by now.
That's true.
Thank you very
Have a
much.
great time in Israel.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy your travels and Chag Sameach,
Chag
Pesach.
Sameach.
Good.
I thought you were going to say that the Bennett family